Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here in Monash. I was saying earlier that I'm only regretting the more that my time passes, I'm on my shortest journey ever to Australia in the last 20 years or so, more than that, in fact. So as every day goes past, I'm trying to pack it all in. So I've already been on a walk, been to Queen Victoria Market, and I'm here now. So it's all happening. So for those of you who don't know much about my background, I actually did my PhD work on Australia's climate politics in the 1990s. So I was based at Macquarie University for a year of those studies, and I can't say that Australia's climate politics has changed that much since then, but I'm always very curious to kind of catch up with how that's going. So perhaps there will be some opportunity for that in questions and discussions later to kind of think about how some of what I'm going to be talking about now, which comes from a European context, but also actually informed in today's talk by some work that which has been led by my colleague Laura Tozer, who's a postdoc on a project working with me at Durham in Cape Town, but where I've also been doing some research. We lead an undergraduate field research project every year to Cape Town, so I've had the privilege to be taking our undergraduate students there for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm rested from that at the moment with dealing with the rest of the NATURVATION project and other things, but it's given me a real interest in the city and the kind of politics around environment that are taking place there. So while Laura's been leading the research there, I've been engaged with that. So some of what I'll tell you today is about stuff that I've been doing directly, and some of it is a bit more of a broader overview about the project to put that into context. So just to tell you a little bit about NATURVATION, these are the wonderful set of institutions and organizations involved with the project. It's funded as part of the Horizon 2020 program in the EU, and I know when you kind of look at EU levels of funding, it is all a bit mind-boggling, and it is indeed a little bit mind-boggling even to those of us who are working on projects in this domain, that currently the European Union are investing something around about 230 million euros in projects around nature-based solutions for cities. So the idea that nature-based solutions are part of a kind of urban sustainability strategy has been taken on board very significantly by the European Commission. And our project is a research and innovation project, but many of these projects are innovation projects, and that means that they are demonstration projects. So they are intended to fund cities in the implementation of nature-based solutions. We'll come on to what a nature-based solution is shortly. So our project, like many, is supposed to undertake these 3 things around advancing assessment. So how do we understand what nature-based solutions are and what their benefits are? How do we enable innovation dynamics around nature-based solutions, and how do we build momentum so that they become mainstreamed? And there are various different aspects of the project, and I'll be touching on some of it today, but if there are particular interests in the room on any of these kind of questions about assessment or innovation or the kind of mainstreaming that I don't get to in the talk, please feel free to ask me during the questions or indeed contact me later. So I'm going to say something about what I think is a kind of interesting shift around the relationship between nature and cities that the very idea of nature-based solutions brings. And then I'm going to say something about the idea of nature-based solutions as a form of natural experiment, if you like, a kind of form of experimental politics, and then go on to the ways in which nature itself matters in those politics, and what we might be seeing emerging in the global scale, a relatively short period of the last 18 months or so of a kind of new transnational politics around urban nature. I hope we'll squeeze that into the next 35 minutes. We'll see how we go, and Rob's going to keep me right for time. Okay, so this is a very brief and in no sense nuanced description of the way in which we might think about how over the last 30 years or so since the Brundtland report in 1986 first introduced the idea that cities should be sustainable, of the different ways in which we've thought about the idea of sustainable cities. And of course there are more kind of names and kind of ideas and imaginaries of the sustainable city that have bubbled up over this time. But I think what's interesting about all of them, eco-cities, low-carbon cities and resilient cities, as I've kind of put them just here for brief summary, is that they're all about how do we make cities more sustainable in order to address nature. And where nature itself is a kind of globalized sense of a common atmosphere, or mostly around climate change. And sometimes about resource and resource use. But the idea is that nature is still, even though cities are addressing nature, nature is still external to the city. And it's the idea that cities, by being more sustainable, will allow us to save nature. and in so doing become improved in their own ways, but still very much dealing with the idea of a kind of globalized, relatively unified and external idea of nature. But something interesting is happening in the kind of waters around nature conservation and the idea of nature. And I particularly like this quote from the IUCN director, Inga Anderson, who has actually just been appointed now head of UNEP, which is itself kind of interesting in terms of where some of the direction of travel might be going, because obviously the kinds of things that she's been saying and doing within IUCN have been appreciated by the global community. Nature can help shelter urban dwellers from the worst impacts of climate change and enable them to lead healthy and fulfilling lives. So here is a kind of idea that by bringing nature into the city, we can improve the idea of what the city is. So we can be more fulfilled. We can lead better lives through integrating nature into the city. So nature can save the city, if you like, from itself, which is itself quite an interesting and intriguing idea. And in doing so, cities will then save nature. So this comes from ICLEI, an organisation that I've worked with for very many years now. And they have recently launched this new platform called Cities with Nature, through which they are kind of trying to make the argument that by working with nature, cities not only save themselves, but can also then contribute to saving the planet. So we're getting a sort of circular economy, if you like, of questions around nature in the city now, which I think is intriguing, because it's really disrupting that idea of a kind of divide between nature and the city in some interesting ways. And nature-based solutions, the idea that working with nature to address sustainable development challenges is a way of improving sustainability in cities, of course, is kind of fitting into this rhetoric. So here just are two definitions of nature-based solutions, and there are very many more out there, but they're nuanced in different ways, but effectively around this idea of solutions that are inspired and supported by nature. Actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems, so that everybody's of course very sensitive to what actually constitutes nature, and that's something that we can maybe pick up in our discussions later. But the idea is that working with nature is a solution. And this again is a sort of shift in the discourse that some of you might be familiar with around ecosystem services, that nature provides a service, to instead an idea that nature should be, whether corralled is the right word, I'm not quite sure, pushed towards providing particular solutions to particular challenges. So a service is just something that exists, but a solution is a solution to a problem that you've identified in the world. And so that also is quite an interesting shift in the language around the role that environment should play, or nature and natural systems should play. So I want to say a little bit now about what we found out in the first half of the NATURVATION project. People say, oh, are you about halfway through? And I say, no, we're nearly more than halfway through as a project convener, which is a lovely and interesting team of people, but I'm glad that we've hit the halfway mark and we're getting through the project now. So I'll say something about the results that we've got from some work, and I think Rob's presented some of this before, some work that we've done which we call the Urban Nature Atlas. And I'll say a little bit about what we found out from the atlas so far before going into some more specific case studies where we can really start to unpack what's happening with the implementation of nature-based solutions. So our atlas of nature-based initiatives in, or experiments, if you use my kind of terminology. Some members of the project team are kind enough to use my terminology some of the time, but we agree on the relatively neutral word of initiatives working across cities. So we selected 100 cities in Europe, and we had a set of different criteria by which we selected them. We wanted to choose cities that were representative of the European population in terms of their economic, social and environmental criteria. So some cities that are regarded as very exposed to climate change, others which are regarded as relatively wealthy in the European system, others which are regarded as relatively poor or having other sorts of social challenges and issues. So those are our 100 cities. And then within each city we've recorded approximately 10 different initiatives using nature-based solutions, and there was a very significant process involving 22 master's students speaking 14 different languages, and the team managed this all really well, and I can tell you more about how we did that. But the results are then an atlas which records for each nature-based initiative that we record, We look at which kind of challenges it's addressing, which kind of sustainable development challenges, broadly based on the Sustainable Development Goals, or 12 of them, what kind of urban nature-based solution it is, and then each one also has like a kind of a very small record and then a longer record underneath it. One of the things people have told us about the Atlas is they really enjoy using it in class. It's a really interesting database for students to play around with. And so if you wanted to, for example, find out how many of these nature-based initiatives in European cities are addressing climate change, it's really easy to kind of set students exercises to kind of go and explore and so on. So in case that might be interesting to you, I'll just flag that as well. So what we find, just a few slides from what we find. I think the team who are responsible for leading the analysis of this database, and Rob's been doing some of it himself as well, would say you probably could just like ask all like hundreds and hundreds of questions of the database and produce, you know, millions of different kinds of results. So I'm just going to like give you a few highlights here. But one here is about the date that these projects were founded, and of course there is a sort of methodological bias here probably, that we're more likely to find records of things which have been done more recently. But nonetheless, this is a relatively significant trend that we see nature-based solutions in this kind of experimental governance mode accelerating over time. Partly that is about working with nature in cities as being a relatively new trend, but it's also, I would argue, this kind of graph really fits a lot of the other work that's been done on urban experimentation more broadly, the kind of work that suggests that government by experiment is a relatively recent phenomena, as cities globally find resources and capacities to govern through kind of long-term planning and strategic intervention more limited, then the government by experiment seems to be replacing that in various ways. And we can sort of take up that wider argument, which I've made in other parts of my work later if you like. But I think that nature-based solutions are kind of caught up into that kind of broader trend about government by experiment. And we find a variety of different kinds of nature-based solutions emerging in these cities. Most interestingly, perhaps, parks and urban green areas dominate. And here we're not just recording parks and green areas that are historic. So we wouldn't necessarily record Hyde Park in London as a nature-based solution formed, you know, 200 more years ago. But instead we would record it if the authorities who manage Hyde Park had decided to replant the park with wildflower meadows for pollination. Then we would call that a nature-based solution because it's using a natural function towards a sustainable development challenge. So it's only when those two things are present that we call it an intervention, because it's changing the existing use. So what's interesting is to see how much activity is actually happening in existing urban spaces. So this is not all just new green roofs and green infrastructure. And in fact, external building greens, roofs and walls is quite limited compared to, for example, allotments in community gardens and the parks and urban green areas. So it's quite a, you know, we might immediately start to think of green infrastructure or green roofs and so on as what nature-based solutions are, but there are lots of other kinds of nature-based solutions which are also emerging in cities. What we found is, the next two slides I'm going to show you is a little bit about what we think are the sustainable development problems that are driving this shift towards nature-based solutions. And it comes from two separate pieces of work that we've done in the project. One led by McKenna Davis and her colleagues at the Ecological Institute, which sought to analyze the multi-level policy context which is shaping the capacity and the spaces for nature-based solutions in Europe. And in their work, which looked at a whole range of different policy areas across the European Union, but also in 6 different national governments, to see where do nature-based solutions turn up, then we see it very much in the green space and habitats, biodiversity kind of policy areas, climate action and environmental quality. And then economic development, but then other things like health and well-being, regeneration, social justice, cultural heritage, very much lower in those policy domains, very much lower interest in sort of nature-based solutions. If we turn that around and look at the work that we discovered in the database in terms of the individual projects that are happening on the ground, we actually see quite a significant difference. Because, okay, green space and biodiversity is the top agenda that these nature-based solutions are being put towards, but actually regeneration and health and well-being are then the next two. And questions of climate action, environmental quality are then down the list. So it's quite intriguing to think that within the policy domains at the urban level and the actors who are working on nature-based solutions on the ground, economic and social drivers are as important in a way as some of the environmental drivers, or indeed more important than some environmental drivers. So of course for the European Commission we call this an opportunity gap, because they like opportunities, as do I indeed. So there is a gap here between suggesting to those practitioners and policymakers who are working with nature-based solutions on the ground that perhaps they are missing out on some of the potential benefits over here, climate action and water management, that might be able to be derived from the particular design and implementation of nature-based solutions. But also to say to the Commission that there's a lot of potential to actually broaden the agenda around working with nature in cities, around the regeneration and health agendas, if only they could get their policy silos at the EU and national levels kind of to break down a little bit. So we think this is really kind of interesting to think about how nature-based solutions are being driven then by a different set of sustainable development drivers at different levels. And this is probably one of the first kind of key findings of our project. And the Commission are themselves quite surprised to see how far up the list regeneration and health are. They were expecting nature-based solutions to be much more driven by climate change concerns. But you know, this kind of data, of course, has its limitations. Working at a kind of database level with, you know, we're really lucky to have had the capacity to pull together kind of 1,000 different examples from across Europe. It's a real privilege to be able to work on a project like this. But it's only going to ever give you a surface and a time, you know, a time-stilled view of what's happening. And so, of course, for us as many social scientists in the project, we're actually dominated by social scientists, which is interesting perspective from which to do interdisciplinary analysis for our science colleagues who are working with us, I think. But we have a lot of case study work in the project as well. And when we dive into the case study work, we can see actually these drivers become very, very complicated when you look at a specific project. So I'm just going to share an example of a case study where I have been working on also with the team from Durham, with Chris, who did this work here. So this is working in Newcastle. I did some of my PhD work in the Newcastle in New South Wales, so I think it's always a bit refreshing to go to the one which is only 10 miles away from where I actually live, that Newcastle. So Newcastle, like many cities in northwest Europe, is experiencing increasing deluge flooding, where the flooding comes not only from, well, it comes from the river a little bit, but it's coming from the inability of the water drainage system in the city to deal with heavy downpour rain. There was a famous incident in Newcastle called Thunder Thursday, so it was a good thing it happened on a Thursday, where the lightning struck the bridge, which you'll know looks a little bit like Sydney Harbour Bridge, and so there's this sort of photograph that goes on every kind of policy document of, you know, the bridge with a lightning strike on it, and the walkways down to the River Tyne, which many of them are staircases, were like waterfalls, just like huge amounts of rain just pouring through the city. And the city was, some new housing development was undermined by the small streams which suddenly flash flooded and then took away the foundations, and nobody was living in the housing, luckily, because it was in the middle of being built, but it fell into the stream on the same day. So there is a real concern with how the drainage system in the city is able to cope with these kind of intense rainfall events. And so across the, and this is in a particular suburb, it's about 3 miles from the centre of Newcastle, and on the River Ousburn, which is one of the tributaries to the Tyne. So in particular, this area, this suburb, has been flooding very frequently, and the Environment Agency and the water company locally have been tasked with how to kind of alleviate the flooding. And their first and initially sort of standard response was to put some concrete drainage and a pumping station in to this area, because, you know, what else would you want to do? So this is what they did. But then if you read through this quote, I know it's quite long, but it was very difficult to find the location where we could install big pits of pipework and shaft within the housing estate to mump it out. And this was because the Environment Agency, it was part, I mean, it was already quite a dense urban neighbourhood and quite challenging to kind of work around. But this was also because the Environment Agency had changed its forecasting in terms of what size of pipework and what size of pumping station would be needed in order to cope with these sort of extreme events. So they were basically saying you need bigger pipes and you need more pumps and you need to kind of size up what you were thinking of being able to fit into this space in the first place. And faced with that, So they took their opportunity of this project to update their model and update their flood risk plans, and I think hydraulically a pumping station wouldn't significantly. So they're basically saying the size of pumping station that they could fit into the space wasn't going to be sufficient for the kind of events they were going to have to manage. And in this context then, they had to go back to the drawing board and do this kind of brainstorming exercise and think instead about the ways in which they could work with nature-based solutions. So when this project is then, and here is the results, sort of bioswales and ponds, and this is the edge of the golf course which is next to the estate, but through the estate as well there are all sorts of different kinds of natural drainage systems that have been installed in order to try and hold the water so that it's not running directly through into the pipe system, so the existing pipe system can cope better. So all sorts of retention ponds and so on and so forth. Now, on the one hand then this gets written up as a case study, well, by us and by others, indeed by the Environment Agency, of the ability for nature-based solutions to deliver on multiple sustainable development goals. But on the other hand, it's also driven by a lack of resources and a lack of capacity and the lack of the space within the city to actually manage the kind of increasing flood risk around climate change in the way that they would traditionally have done. So here, in a sense, climate change is disrupting business as usual and requiring new kinds of ways of working with infrastructure and thinking differently about what infrastructure is and bringing nature into being part of the infrastructure. And so this is this case study, among several others, has started us, and indeed Rob and I, due to be working on a paper which neither of us really doing at the moment, but trying to think through more, and I'm going to share with you now a little bit more about what does it mean for nature to become then part of the infrastructure in the city, and what kinds of politics does that affect. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. I warned Rob that I might surprise him with a few things I've developed since we last talked about this paper, and he wasn't to ask me any difficult questions about it, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so what I wanted to kind of use that kind of vignette from Newcastle to suggest is that we can see nature-based solutions now as forms of experimenting with what it means to infrastructure in the city. To take Keller Easterling's work here, new processes of infrastructuring are happening within the city through the use of nature-based solutions. But also, as many who work on urban infrastructure have told us, we should not think of such infrastructures as kind of inert and apolitical. They don't just come into cities and just function, but they have within them ingrained sets of power relations, kinds of economy, political economy, and of course political ecologies embedded within them. So they are about dynamics of power and agency. They're also central to the ways in which we think about the city as a modern entity. And so this is one of the things that I think is really intriguing about the bringing of nature-based solutions back into the city as part of infrastructure was, of course, that part of what the kind of modern ideal of infrastructure was supposed to do was to exclude forms of nature from the city and actually create more forms of control. So I think it's one of the other reasons why we can think about nature-based solutions as offering quite some disruption to the ideas of how we think about what a modern city should be and how it should function. So I would argue on this kind of basis of this sort of logic that how and in what ways different ideas of nature, so not only nature itself, but the idea of what nature should be doing and its function in the city, and its capacities, then have a significant consequence for both the way in which cities operate, but also for how our kind of imaginations of the future city. So I'm going to use some of the work that we've done in Cape Town to just illustrate this a little bit. Cape Town always offers, in some senses, extremes, and so perhaps this doesn't work in all contexts to think of it in this way, but we'll see, we'll find out. And this is also then tied up with how we think about nature, is also tied up with this very long-running debate I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with, about what it is about nature that we value and how those values actually come to be recognised and realised. A debate which is long-standing within the environmental science community and across the environmental studies community more broadly, but which has recently reached the front pages and headlines of Nature, if you didn't see it, Nature carried an article suggesting that what was at stake at the moment was the battle for the soul of biodiversity. Of course, there'll be some environmental philosophers who argue that maybe nature doesn't have a soul, but nonetheless, the soul of biodiversity is currently up for grabs. As within the IPBES, and I'm not good on my acronyms here, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's the equivalent of the IPCC for the Biodiversity Convention. This debate between whether we should regard nature as a service and focus on the ecosystem service benefits that nature provides, and effectively there's a long-standing critique about the sort of instrumentalization and economization of nature that goes with such an approach, to a new kind of wing within the IPBS, which is suggesting that we should think about the benefits of nature much more broadly, also thinking of their intrinsic properties of nature as something that cannot be translated into a service sort of framework. And this is where the kind of battle for the soul of biodiversity is happening. So what I want to suggest is that the ways in which we might think about nature in these kind of, forms as a service or as a set of other kinds of properties and values and benefits plays out in the ways in which nature-based solutions are being formed and then brought into infrastructures, and in doing so recreating different kinds of ideas about the relationship between nature and society. So to Cape Town, and a view from a specific Table Mountain. If you haven't been up there, it is a fantastic view. But one of the things, of course, the city has been facing, and this picture tries to capture to a certain extent, is a really significant period of water shortage. So much so that you probably will have seen the headlines a year or so ago about the city, perhaps reaching day zero in terms of the availability of drinking water, which was around about February last year. Since then, the winter rains last July and August were sufficient that the dams are now replenished to about 35 or 40% of their capacity, so there's some short-term relief. But one of the things that this is provoking is a whole set of different kinds of interventions about how to manage water in the city, and amongst those, and perhaps not the most dominant in the rush for quick solutions to the water crisis, but nonetheless the idea that one should intervene to manage nature and nature-based and ecosystems in the city and in its catchment in order to manage water is a very significant one. So we're particularly looking at a project called the Water Fund, developed by the US NGO, the Nature Conservancy, which was about bringing together a whole set of different actors, basically downstream water users and upstream land managers, in order to clear invasive species, in this case Australian gum trees, from the water catchment in order to replenish the aquifer. So this is integrating land clearance as form of infrastructure management in the city to create the aquifer and the natural planting and soil management as part of what constituted the water infrastructure, the supply infrastructure of the city. This project in detail, we found that there were, as I say here, making nature infrastructural in this case relied on different ways in which nature was positioned as providing resilience. And we found that these different kinds of views of nature were all very important to allowing this project to take place. So on the one hand, there was very clearly a sort of functionalist perspective here on what nature should do, very much a kind of ecosystem service-based perspective, backed up by the investment of the Nature Conservancy and other organizations in scientific reports and studies, trying to monitor how much, the clearance of how many square meters of the catchment of different species would provide to the aquifer and so on and so forth. Very much a kind of functionalist service approach. On the other hand, there were whole sets of studies and arguments about the wider benefits, nature's contributions to people. What would working with nature enable that was more than working with infrastructure of a grey kind would enable? This really centered on employment. In a city which really desperate for jobs, nature clearance and the jobs particularly for women and unemployed women for clearing their species was seen to be really significant. So here, working with nature was good and had its own value because it allowed you to create new forms of employment. But also there was this very strong idea of the worth of this, so nature's own intrinsic value, that there was some value to be found in restoring nature to some form of original state that had its own value above and beyond what a scientific study could measure or what the number of people employed in a project could measure. So all these different forms of value were critical to actually enabling the different kinds of actors to get around the table and to be able to all participate in the project. And they were held together in a very sort of fragile coalition, and in a sense it worked because all the different actors and groups involved who were promoting these different reasons for why you might want to work with nature-based solutions all knew that they shouldn't try to advance their own case above the cases of the others, because one of these arguments by themselves wouldn't be sufficient to make the project work. So it was a kind of uneasy coalition of very different reasons and very different ideas about what nature should be able to do as part of the infrastructure in the city, but nonetheless held together through the kind of institutionalized structure of the Water Fund itself. And I want to make the argument that in doing so, these different kinds of ideas of nature then sort of feed into these different ways in which why we think about nature, or why the arguments were able to be made that working with nature was a more resilient approach to the water crisis that Cape Town was facing, because of these different kinds of resonances about what constitutes resilience that it was able to promote. And this sort of layered approach to what constituted resilience was also what enabled the Nature Conservancy to bring the funding and the actors together to say, you know, building desalination plants quickly and at expense is not a very resilient strategy. We're working with nature can be resilient because we know that nature has services. These functions that nature provides are resilient. They will carry on being there even after we've left. That resilience is achieved through multiplicity, through having multiple different kinds of benefits. This system will be resilient to different kinds of environmental and political contexts. And that the very sense that nature endures over time, and that these ecosystems which are of course regarded as, the fynbos is regarded as particularly important, that its endurance to a changing climate will be significant as well. So this kind of multi-layered idea about what resilience was also critical to the kind of politics of being able to include land clearance as part of the infrastructure of Cape Town's water supply. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I know that I'm not going to have enough time to discuss this with you in detail. But one of the things that this is leading us to, and this is kind of opening up new work for us at the moment, and very much kind of preliminary understandings, is that when we start to think about these multiple different kind of ideas around nature and different kinds of ways in which resilience might be considered and championed, we also can then think that making approaches to nature-based solutions inclusive is not only about accessing the nature-based solutions at the end of the day when they've been created, but is also about making them inclusive of multiple different ways of knowing, valuing and understanding nature. And that's work that we're trying to open up at the moment to say most of the work around inclusion and exclusion around nature-based solutions in cities focuses on questions of green gentrification and exclusion of different kinds of people from different areas of nature in cities, but actually questions of whose nature is being produced with what kinds of values and for what reasons. I think there's much of that work actually is probably being led by academics working in the Australian context and maybe in some Canadian context as well actually, but in the European area these kind of questions about whether to make nature-based solutions inclusive and empowering, we need to also think about these different ideas of nature and the different values of them that are being brought to bear. It still remains relatively marginal to the discussion. So, yeah, I could speak for quite a long time more about this particular case study as well, where this idea of, within the Water Fund, these ideas of different values of nature have been able to be held in place, albeit in a relatively precarious way. In other case studies that we've worked in the city in Cape Town, it's been much harder to get to that kind of level of agreement, or agreement to disagree about why nature is valuable. And this is an area called Two Rivers Urban Park, which is about 5 kilometers from the downtown of Cape Town. It also has amazing kind of views to the mountains. It this is a wetland reserve, which you can see this should actually have a gate over it. It's a gated area and highly fenced in to exclude local communities from accessing the nature reserve. But also this whole Two Rivers Urban Park is crisscrossed by freeways. It's got high security prisons there. It's got this was an interesting field trip. It has it is the place where two rivers meet, one of which has been restored, or one of which has not. And it probably won't surprise you to know that one of those rivers flows through a previously black area of the city, designated black, and the one flows through a previously designated white area of the city. And not going to take any, I'm not going to give you any money for guessing which is the one that's just been cleaned up. And so it's a highly contested space where, on the one hand, the regional and local governments want to redevelop the area to provide housing and jobs and employment, and to create a small area of green space that would be a public park that would be securitized and accessible to all. On the other hand, conservationists and those interested in cultural heritage in the city want to retain the existing open space because it provides important flood management. It's also a site of cultural heritage for populations from indigenous populations from South Africa and so on and so forth. So it's highly contested at the moment. So how to deal with the kind of gating off of nature in the city, and particularly in those kind of post-apartheid, post-conflict areas, is going to be a really significant challenge. So this is not really a nature-based solution for anyone right now, this wetland, and how to move these kinds of areas of the city forward and restore them in ways that are inclusive and empowering is a really challenging issue in a city like Cape Town. Yeah. So on the one hand, that's good because I've got about 3 more slides. On the one hand, we could say, okay, well, those are important issues and they're important in those particular urban contexts, and we need to pay attention to them. And that would, I think, even still be enough of a research agenda for us to be interested in. But one of the things which has happened in the last sort of 18 months or so is this kind of, what I would suggest is a kind of remobilizing of the idea of urban nature as part of a new kind of transnational politics of cities. And so it starts to then matter even more because particular ideas about urban nature are now being relayed transnationally. So some of these debates, which may have once been sort of localized, are now becoming, in a way, globalized through these transnational city networks. In a sense, this was I've had a series of fortunate events in my career, and probably this is another one of them, is that some of you will know that I've worked on transnational city networks for some time. I thought I kind of left that behind. I mean, not left it behind, I'm interested in it still, but I definitely didn't think I was doing that in this project. And then over the last 18 months, various different international organizations have started to mobilize urban nature as a new form of transnational urban politics, so I can't resist jumping into it. So on the one hand, we have climate cities networks like the ICLEI, who are now promoting the idea of cities with nature. We have, of course, climate resilience cities networks like 100 Resilience Cities, who have been working on nature-based solutions in various ways for quite some time, but relatively sort of cut off from the mainstream of other kinds of transnational city work. And perhaps for me, most interestingly, that biodiversity and conservation NGOs are now really promoting the city as a means to which to realize their goals. So World Wetland Day in 2018 was about city wetlands, and we have both the Nature Conservancy and IUCN setting up city-based networks for cities to work together to bring nature-based solutions into cities. Some of, as Rob has already told you, I don't have enough time to talk to you about this in detail, but we think that this is being driven by 3 key things: shifting governance arrangements around which kind of actors are mobilized in transnational city networks, and that also means donor organizations, philanthropists, the kinds of funding that are coming into those organizations are opening up the possibilities for nature groups to be involved, and that is also leading to an increasing diversity of actors. But particularly this kind of third aspect is that as climate change as an issue has grown and developed, the objects which climate change governance is concerned with have multiplied as well. So climate change governance is now about meat and dairy and plastics and cement and all sorts of other things that 10 years ago weren't on the agenda. And we'd argue that sort of nature is part of that shifting set of objectives as well. So for various different reasons, then we're seeing this transnationalization of the idea of urban nature. So I think then it matters even more that we attend to the kinds of forms of the kinds of forms and meanings and imaginations that urban nature has been given, because its politics will not remain contained within particular sites and cities, but is increasingly being part of a new transnational drive to make urban nature count and matter for global politics. So I'll leave you with a few concluding thoughts, but thank you for your time.
Thanks, Harriet.